And this evening, of course, Dr. Woodward will be speaking on Darwin's Last Stand, the new evidence that shatters the credibility of evolutionary theory. So it's a great honor to have him with us this evening, and please, if you will, accord Dr. Woodward a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. May I bring my mascot up?
Oh, of course.
Okay. Yeah, this 21-rung little model of DNA is my good friend. We've been around the U.S. We've been to Denmark and Norway and Poland and some other interesting places in the Far East. So this little 21-rung snippet approximates the shortest gene ever discovered. Most short genes would be about 10 times longer than this. So instead of 21 rungs, you would have approximately 250 up to 500. That's a short gene. Long genes would run from here all the way to the end of the building, out to the driveway, and about 5 miles down. Okay, that would be the longest genes. So, and to approximate the amount of DNA in one human cell, you would need about 145 million of these models. As a matter of fact, I calculated if you laid them out tightly, like wedged in with no space between them across a football field, we found out that you would really cover the football field, then cover it again, and cover it again, just heaping it up, and you would eventually go up 350 feet. And that's the DNA in one human cell. So I'm amazed that there's now a whole layer we have at our website, DNAandBeyond.org. That's a sister organization. So it was actually inspired by Bed Bath & Beyond, to be honest. My son Daniel, who was here when I did the epigenetics talk with his family from Columbus, Georgia. But anyway, Bed Bath & Beyond inspired DNAandBeyond.org. You have to add the .org at the end. And you can see a 2-minute demo, and you can see not only the color code that we developed and the 2 methyl tags, really cute. They look like a Mickey Mouse with an extra ear. So the carbon with 3 hydrogens, and they pop in to put it to sleep, and they pop off to wake it up to do its work. And then we, of course, have the all-important DNA song. Would you like me to sing it?
Yes.
Okay. And remember, A always goes with T, and C always goes with G. I have a mnemonic device I'll share in a minute. Let me go ahead and just sing it with a little demo. Let's do it right, okay? There we go. All right. A with T and C with G, held in place by D and P. When I rest, you will see methyl tags plugged into C's. At this point, we stick in the little methyl guys. Now I know my ATCGs, won't you come and twist with me? Okay, so we have a follow-up, thank you. We have a follow-up where we've developed an RNA song. RNA has a code almost the same, except it's the T, in our case, it's tiger tangerine. Another name for orange is tiger tangerine. Turns into a U. So we have a brown tube that is umber colored, okay? Umber, U stands for uracil. And so we can turn this into that. And then we have a couple new guys. So Reggie, by the way, Reggie Davis, fellow apologist from Tampa Bay, just completed a career 20 years flying the 777 for American Airlines to Europe and Latin America, around the world. Reggie Davis, would you stand? Thank you for coming up. So you can pray for us. I can just do the handoff. The amino acids made it. So we have a variety of 7 of these guys that literally link up together, helped into place by the tRNAs. So some of you have studied transfer RNA. Isn't that cute? We even have the cloverleaf shape. Using Velcro, they clasp their hands like they're praying, and they bring that right into the system. So that's something we've developed as a kind of a help to science teaching, but also a help to explaining the signal. And that's going to be the unifying thought I would submit for your consideration. There is a signal coming from the cell. Not only from the cell of humans, but from the cell of every living creature. And it's very important to realize that alliances are being almost shattered to pieces. I mean, the normal lineup of who is questioning Darwinian theory includes not just believers, Christians, other theists, but includes out-and-out atheist or agnostic scholars, and we'll meet at least 1 or 2 of those. And then lining up on the other side, declaring that Darwin got it right, are not just mainline Christian leaders or scholars, but you even have evangelical, well-known evangelical figures, saying Darwin is right, so in order to not hinder evangelism, you should not question Darwin. Now, personally, I don't think that that is based on good evidence. It's based more on peer pressure and some other factors we will talk about. But what I would like to do is just say up front that we're going to be talking about this whole issue in relation to the big questions of how we got here, but also kind of gearing it toward the idea of theistic evolution. Now, there's a new book that came out. It's a bombshell. It's a beefy bombshell, about 1,000 pages. It makes a really good doorstop. You ever have a rattly door and you just kind of jam a big rock or a fossil or whatever we do in our house? We like fossils. So Theistic Evolution, and the subtitle is Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique. It is a great resource. So let me just go ahead and show you a couple of other resources that we're recommending that are more internet. Okay, here they are. DNAandBeyond.org, already mentioned that. And here are two other resources that are, actually three other resources that we recommend in the area of apologetics or information on this whole issue of origins, Darwinism, creation, intelligent design. Evolutionnews.org, fabulous source. Probably 3 to 5 new articles, very brief, readable articles every day. Apologetics.org, we're blessed to have that website for our own C.S. Lewis Society. A lot of videos, a really fantastic cluster that were just provided to us by apologists. And some of you may not be able to see that, but that's crev.info. Can you see that? crev.info. So those are my favorite sources, my go-to websites if I want to be up on the latest news. So let's jump right in and talk about the whole basic idea of detecting design. And I'm going to submit that we can, ordinary, and I don't mean just adults or people who've studied science, but kids, elementary age, can detect design with, generally speaking, amazing accuracy. Now, this isn't just my idea. It's as old as not just the Bible. It's as old as philosophers or ordinary, just logical thinkers have thought about this question. Now, that is an interesting sand dune whipped up by an amazing storm that was barreling northward to the Atacama Desert in Chile. How do you like my theory? Plausible or not? No. Oh, thank you. Okay. Why do you recognize instantly that is not just a lucky, accidental shape put together by a sandstorm? It matches what? Yeah, the shape of a hand. We know our hand. We see it every day. And so the actual story, that's about 20 feet tall, I'm told. You can see some graffiti scribbled near the base. And that is on the road, just off the road, heading north toward Ecuador from Chile as they go through the Atacama Desert, called La Mano del Desierto. And the eccentric sculptor decided he just wanted to make a really big hand breaking through the sandy soil there. Now, what I'm going to just say is an attempt to bring, again, common sense to this area. It's to ask this question. Is the detection, which we all made, that this is designed, is that a religious idea or just a logical inference? Okay? Did you shift into your religious mode of thinking to detect that? No. You just used rational, ordinary, this kind of result is always linked with this kind of, cause. This kind of effect can always be traced back to intelligence. And that's the inherent logic of the design theory. I want to just enlighten, as it were, us on the basics of how we understand design. And when we get into this question of the lineups, the rather unusual alliances that are being made to discuss this issue, is that we find even renowned atheists such as Thomas Nagel, now retired, maybe that's why he's so open about it. He doesn't have to face his faculty members at the NYU. He formerly at Princeton when I was a student there. But he is one of the world's leading experts on the philosophy of consciousness. And he really shook up the world when Oxford Press brought out his book, Mind and Cosmos. It was about 7 years ago. I've published a review on this. If you want to see me later, I can give you the URL. But Thomas Nagel was a scholar of this area. He just had a keen interest. because he just couldn't figure out where consciousness came from. It didn't seem logical to him that the Darwinian blind, one letter of DNA at a time, one mutation at a time, would put together such a wondrous thing as the human brain, which is interacting with something mysterious called our consciousness. So he basically went to the greatest efforts he could to research the area, and he produced this book. It caused just an uproar in the academic world. Some of his fellow atheists said he's gone off the edge. He is not, rational anymore. But he stuck to his guns, and he said, I think Darwinian theory will come to be laughed at in the next generation. And then he stuck his neck out and said, Michael Behe, the biochemist who wrote Darwin's Black Box, Steve Meyer, David Berlinski, the agnostic physicist and mathematician who has defended design, these guys deserve our appreciation for what they've done, the scholarship they produce, not our scorn. The way they've been treated is manifestly unfair. That's a direct quote from chapter 1. Wow. How often does an atheist, who, by the way, says in the book, I don't want to even consider creation. Now everybody says, no, wait a minute. You said he likes to bash or critique at least Darwin's theory, but he's not willing to go to the intelligent designer option. What does he do? He tries to take mentality or mind and spread it thinly, like a thin coat of paint, over all physical reality. It's as if you took the greatest mind you can imagine, cut it up in a trillion bits, and glued each little bit of that formerly great mind, now reduced to bits, and kind of snuggle it up alongside each bit of matter. It's a bit like the Force be with you, Luke, right? The kind of Star Wars worldview. It is what it is. It's a revival somewhat of Stoicism from the time of Christ. But very interestingly, he went as far as to give this subtitle. This is not too subtle as a subtitle of his book. Why the materialist neo-Darwinist conception of nature is almost certainly false. What do you think of that? Very subtle? It's very clear. And I noticed as a philosopher he had to put the word almost instead of just certainly false. So we see an alignment. And then we see on the other side, of course, we'll get to that in a moment, such noted and renowned true blue Christian scholars as some very, very famous biochemists who actually will bring them out and let you see what they've said. The signal is spoken of in Scripture in very clear terms, and that includes this, one of my all-time favorite passages from Zechariah 12, and it's the opening of a prophetic discourse, prophetic passage, and it says, of course, the Lord is speaking, who stretches out the heavens. Very interesting description. By the way, confirmed in the 20th century, but declared 27 centuries ago by Isaiah and 24 centuries ago in the book of Zechariah. Who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth. So we're moving from astronomy to geology, and who forms the spirit of man within him. So from astronomy to geology to psychology, the suke, the spirit of man, or in the Old Testament, ruach, the spirit of man. Okay, so what we see here is 3 tiers, and we could add in other components of science. So when a scientist discovers something, if he's a Christian-oriented scientist, or a theist at least, he can look at that discovery and say, wow, so that's how God did it. And you're really experiencing a glimpse of the greatness of the mind of God. That's actually what fired up science in the first place. All historians are now, with almost no exceptions, agreeing that it was the soil of the Christian worldview that launched science in the late 1400s, really starting in the 1300s, but then it blazed to a new level in the 1500s and beyond. So I love that, and I'm just going to mention another one, going to bring in a little snippet of DNA here. Do you like our little representation there? It's about 20 rungs on that particular part. And Romans 1:20. Now, Romans 1:20 is the equivalent in the New Testament of what is we find in Psalm 19. And so I'm just going to read Romans 1:20 from I believe this is the ESV. And I'll start at verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them, that is, men and women, boys and girls generally, because God has shown it to them. How has He shown it? For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made so that they are without excuse. Now, divine power, his divine nature and intelligence, his exquisite, genius-level craftsmanship is displayed, and that's what we're going to look at. And the question is, how did it get there? There are different ideas. We want to kind of review those quickly as we move on into the particulars of the data itself. Part of the data I mentioned. I'm not going to really do a lot more on DNA. My students at Trinity College in Florida sometimes call me Dr. DNA. That's my nickname. Why? I'm always talking about DNA. Why do I do that? I see it as the signature of intelligence. Because the code of DNA is identical to a computer code. And in fact, each cell, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot, and those 145 million models amount to 3.1 gigabyte hard drive. And you have in your body approximately 30 to 35 trillion copies of that 3.1 gigabyte hard drive. You guys are walking two-legged mountains of information, okay? And it's amazing. I mean, only in the 20th and 21st century do we get to really see how marvelously and amazingly and wondrously made we are, as alluded to, of course, in Psalm 139. It is organized, the genes, 20,000 genes in the human genome is organized into files and folders. Now, I don't know if you have the task. I find myself always dragging my files and organizing them into folders. I just have to do that. My wife says, do you realize your screen is almost filled with those icons? Yes, dear, I will organize them. And so I create one, like, March 2019, drag, 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 drag. Okay, that's not very well organized. The files, that is the genes, are exquisitely organized into related, geographically organized, generally speaking, file folders. Is that by chance? Much of the DNA was said to be junk as recently as 2001, 2003, even, if I could mention Francis Collins, Language of God. Anybody read that book? I read it, and I thought it was very interesting. Had an interesting conversation with Dr. Collins about part of the book, which I could allude to later. But that book said, we know that we evolved through a Darwinian process because of the junk that's in our DNA. Whoa, well, what about 2007? When a group of labs across the world discovered that most of the DNA, anywhere from 55 to 95% of our DNA, is functional. So there's almost not much junk to talk about. Fortunately, Francis Collins admitted in 2016 that he was wrong on that area. There's virtually no junk DNA. Most of it is functional. Of course, some of it gets broken and mutated, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. So not only is that marvelous, but we have a new set of codes sitting on top of DNA, epigenetics. So what is epigenetics? It just means that above the DNA double helix, you have chemical tags and flags attached, which have their own meaning. And we're just learning, we're decoding the code right now. Some of them are located directly on the DNA, some of them are sitting on little wiggly tails, because DNA is wound around spools. It goes around, if the spool were here, it would be about as big as, well, let's say a large, what do you call them, these large beach balls? It was about 1.5 feet wide. Make that elongated, wrap 2 windings of DNA around it, and you have a histone. And the histone has little system of tails, and chemical signals are attached to those tails. And this is called the histone code. And I'm just getting started. There's information embedded along the microtubules that are anchored at the centrosome near the center of the cell. And the exact position of those microtubules, three-dimensionally, adds an additional layer of information. The cortex, the membrane, and the cortical fluids and actual surface of proteins, along with the lipids, of course, you have this bilayer of lipids, but the proteins and sugar molecules that cover the cell add yet another code. So these carry a signal to the next generation, and guess what? They can be changed. They can be reprogrammed. Health habits determine what kind of epigenetic blessing or stumbling block is passed to the next generation. It's amazing how high-tech these systems look. So these epigenetic signals, again, I think are adding to the total signal that says, I am designed. I am designed. Now that's on the design side. Now what about the Darwin side? You have this other proposed solution, this explanation that was put forth in the, 1859 is when it was originally published, Origin of Species. And it went through 6 editions. Darwin died 1882. So in that period, basically the late 1800s, you have a radical new theory coming to the front. Common ancestry is the idea that all life is connected, that you are a distant cousin to not only a giraffe, but a geranium. And I would say, Jeffrey, a chrysanthemum. We were talking about a chrysanthemum. You know, the tulip, T-U-L-I-P. And some people want to revamp it and make it roses, this Armenian Calvinist dialogue. And I found out that, unbeknownst to me, Areopagus has come up with chrysanthemum. I think that's one of the most fascinating theological ideas I've ever heard. I'm waiting to hear what those letters stand for. Okay. So, but what we're going to do, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to stick this on my ear and squinch it, and it's going to be very well behaved, okay? So, common ancestry, that means all life forms are interconnected from some root or some base of this tree all the way up to, wait a minute, the highest person is not a person, it's a poodle. Well, that's okay. Dog lover made this tree chart. So the idea of common ancestry is very deeply rooted, no pun intended, okay, in the thought of Darwinism. It's like something that you can't quickly reject. You can reject some of the other parts of the theory, but you got to hold on to that. But this is now extremely shaky in my estimate based on research I've been doing. Then you have the rising, as it were, the arrow of improvement, of rapid not only diversification, but complexification. Animals get more complex, not just their DNA, but their organs, Some of these organs that are found in nature are spectacular, and we could give many, many examples. But mutations, and this is actually where Darwin's theory, this is his contribution, natural selection. Natural selection, that is the all-important creator substitute, if you will. Now, at the root of the tree, part 3 of the theory was really not dealt with by Darwin. He just wrote a couple comments in a letter to a friend, and that's the origin of life by a blind process. And I'll just see if we can just show you this real quickly. Luke, can you see that? Is it okay to move this little lectern to the left? Are you happy with that? Is it okay? Is that permitted? Very good. Okay. So Luca, not Luke. This is Luke's sister, Luca. Okay. So Luca stands for last universal common ancestor. Last universal common ancestor. In the literature, you will read scientists talk about now Luca, as if it was a person, but it's a pulsating, supposedly very primitive bacterium. So we got that? Luca. If there was a Luca, then that is the ultimate Adam and Eve. You see, we're ultimately traced back not just to our original pair created by God, Adam and Eve, as we see in Genesis, and Paul even refers to it. Very importantly, in Romans 5, he says the literal Jesus is the second man, the first man is Adam. And if that theological structure is going to exist, in my view, that I'm getting into Bible a little bit, hope that's okay. Okay, so that whole parallel is depending on the reality, historical rootedness of Adam. That's my sidebar. But Luca, if this is the Adam and Eve, that raises questions about, well, what else is affected if the scientific story trumps the biblical account? Well, let's just mention very quickly that Luca has come into some very interesting times. Because the scientists, I actually talked to an Ohio State scientist, very important molecular biologist, and he said to me, I suspect we'll need about 60 genes for the origin of life. He wasn't even close. Others speculated 250 genes. I mean, just to get the basic mechanics of turning DNA into RNA and RNA into proteins, and that's, by the way, that's what you learn in 7th grade now. DNA makes RNA, RNA makes proteins. For that to happen, you need almost 200 very exquisitely designed genes just for that. What they did in Craig Venter's shop, and by the way, he is, as far as I know, still an atheist, but he came out with a discovery just 2 years ago, they blended 2 bacteria together, and they finally got it down to 473 genes. And they kept knocking out genes, and they would say, "Are you still alive?" And the bacteria would just be dead, okay? And they would back up. Well, that's an important gene, that we need that for it to survive. And they knocked this one out. "Are you still alive?" And the bacteria, in effect, would say, "Just barely, please don't take any more genes away." "Oh, that's okay, we're just working with you." And so finally they got down to this set, and they determined, and when I saw that figure, this just a few years back, I said, this is actually a colony of these created Sin .30. That means their third attempt over a period of nearly 10 years to do this. So this is supposedly Luca. 473 genes, each one an average of 1,000 rungs on the DNA sequence. Do the math. 473,000 letters of DNA. That's about the equivalent of 100 pages of a paperback book. Now I can see spilling Scrabble letters on the ground, and a couple of them by chance forming like hi, or maybe rarely Tom, or maybe more complex, longer words, but not 473,000 letters coming together. I don't have enough faith to believe in that happenstance coming together. One scientist said, well, if we had infinite number of universes out there, it might happen. This is a favorite escape route. They're resorting to physics, and physics, I could ask Eric. Dr. Eric might, hopefully, would endorse what I'm about to say. Even the idea of multiple universes popping out one after another entails a universe creation mechanism, which probably is just as fine-tuned as any putative universe. But the key question is, do we have any evidence of other universes existing? No. And even hypothetically, some very important astronomers have said that as well. So that's our dive into genetics. I think that's just about all the genetics we need. We might, come back slightly later. Now we're into the theory, this theistic evolution. Here's Francis Collins. He ran the Human Genome Project. He's now, since Obama appointed him, President Obama appointed, I think it was around the year 2009. He was appointed director of NIH, and responsible for making hundreds of millions of dollars of grant decisions. So he takes this standard Darwinian theory, macroevolution, driven, notice, by undirected processes, and of course that leads to, according to the theory, the complexity and diversity of all life, including us, Homo sapiens. So that's the theory, and what he does, he says, let's bring in God as the source, the one who programmed the universe to be fruitful, in terms of the raw materials and the laws of physics and chemistry. Be fruitful and complexify and produce Luca, and then just let it roll on from there. Now, I actually did some research in this wonderful, massive volume, Theistic Evolution, the scientific, philosophical, theological critique. And I found out that Collins and the other theistic evolutionist biologist, Giberson, I think is how he pronounces it, made this statement. These are the two most boring slides of my presentation. Can you hang in there for 2 quotes? Okay, just, if your neighbor nods off, just give him a little nudge. Okay, so this is what Collins and Giberson said in their book published by University Press not too long, about 4 years ago. The model for divinely guided evolution that we are proposing here thus requires no intrusions from outside, key phrase, for its account of God's creative process, except for the origins of natural laws guiding the process. Can you see that? So God created the laws, and after that he sat in the balcony or the bleachers and kind of sat back. Oh, look at all that happening. Isn't that wonderful? Oh, just like I planned. Rolling on, producing through natural law. I mean, really, it's taking Darwinian theory and putting God did it at the top. Okay? Now, let me just, for clarity, he actually, in another place, I think this is actually the language of God, if I remember. He had 6 points, and this is point 3 and 4. I think I had point 3 and 4. Yeah. Okay, this is the second, and this will give a little bit more, in-depth view of what he's saying. While the precise mechanism of the origin of life on Earth remains unknown. Okay, getting to Luca. So he's hedging his bet. Well, maybe we'll never come up with a natural explanation of Luca. Okay. While the precise mechanism of the origin of life remains unknown, once life arose, the process of evolution and natural selection permitted the development of biological diversity and complexity over very long periods of time. Point 4, which if you can't see it, I'll just read it real quickly. Once evolution got underway, no special supernatural intervention was required. So that, in a nutshell, is what not only Dr. Collins is saying, but the organization BioLogos. You may have heard of them. They have a very well-funded website. And many famous preachers in evangelical churches have been invited to BioLogos conferences. Never is an intelligent design scholar invited. It's always from the BioLogos side. And many of them have been persuaded to go that route. And their, the parishioners and the youth groups basically are assured Darwin's theory is solid. And they don't require you to, take that view, but that's what's presented in that context. Now, I think the important thing to realize is this is a testable notion, because you can test it biblically, you can test it philosophically, but tonight I want to focus in on testing it, again, scientifically. Because this is a really, really, really important notion. Let me just mention that when I was a student, my freshman year at Princeton University, I was entering 68, so this is spring 69. I felt, as an atheist student, that the Christians were completely clueless when it comes to science. And I was basically trying to question not only the theory myself, but try to get the students to question at least the idea of creation, especially the idea that there was science for creation. And it wasn't until I began dialoguing with the leader of a Christian group, Princeton Evangelical Fellowship, that they began to share Isaiah 53. Very important passage. And other passages from the New Testament. And so I was dealing with it at the science level, but this kind of like, you mean there's evidence? There's prophetic evidence? Because that's what I wanted. Just some evidence to believe in God. And I was sure that actually evolution was 100% proven. So I was hitting the evolution thing, but I didn't know what to say on the biblical side. After 6 months of debate, dialogue, and investigative Bible study, I sensed God reaching into my heart, saying that I had broken his moral law, and that Christ had not only died for me, but arisen from the dead. And when I trusted him, exactly 50 years ago this week, the end of my freshman year, it was at 24 Moore Street, just off the campus. And Bill Fay, the assistant to the 78-year-old founder, Dr. Fullerton, Bill Fay, Princeton grad, came to Christ at that same university, was leading my Bible study one-on-one for 2 months, probably 3 months at that point. And he said, it's like looking at a chair. You don't have to, prove it intellectually, but intellectually, it will hold you. You're confident, and you put your weight on it, and that's when you're trusting in Christ. And I thought to myself, I need to sit on the chair. I said, do you have to do it? Do I have to do it here now in front of you? He said, no, you can do it privately in your room. Just let me know if you do. I said, I might as well get it over with now. I think I'm going to do it sooner or later. So at this point, unlike a bogus prayer that I had prayed 6 months earlier, just to get somebody off my back. Anybody have done that? Okay, so this time, genuinely, led by God, I trusted, and instantly I sensed, I know where I'm going when I die, not because of any good thing I've done, but because of what Christ has done for me. And as I walked out, he did a little follow-up, and I was walking back to my dorm room. I said, my God, my number one request, as I'm now in your family, I really don't want to be involved with this Princeton Evangelical Fellowship. They're all a bunch of creationists. Lord, I'm a Darwinist. That was my first prayer. And I can imagine God say, permission denied. Because he knew, I might be actually raising questions in this same topic later on. And within a couple days, that whole kind of fog of confusion just blew away. I began meeting with a guy who originally witnessed to me, Dr. Fullerton. And later that summer at Westerly Road Church, a Bible church in Princeton, I was literally talking with a guy at the back of the church, and he said, the fossils are the decisive evidence. I said, fossils prove evolution. No, they don't. And that's where we're going to go now. Okay, we're going to go in the direction of fossil evidence. And that's where I think is really, really crucial. Let me just say, as we go there, that Michael Behe's work is very, very important. So it's not on genetics, it's more like on machines in the cell. So I'll mention him in passing. Machines, blood clotting machines in your cell actually is a 20-part system. And if you didn't have all 20 of those different proteins, when the signal of oxygen alert, air has entered, if that original signal didn't trigger the first, which turned on the second, which activated the third, which set in motion the fourth, etc., and then if it didn't go through all 20 steps, then your blood would just congeal and clot right now, because you need all 20 of those. In other words, you would either bleed to death or your blood would clot when it's not supposed to clot. And this is just one of many, many examples in Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. His third book, Masterpiece, just came out a month and a half ago. We have a couple copies left. It's called Darwin Devolves. And so that still is a strong message. The doubts about Darwin really deals with abiogenesis, origin of the first cell, mechanisms of selection and mutation, and then common ancestry. That is, did we all come from Luca? So in the remaining time, I'm going to go very, very fast. Let me reference Meyer's book, Steve Meyer's Signature in the Cell, for that first question. I can't get into that anymore. I would keep you here till 10 o'clock, and I don't want to do that. I want to speak for about another 15 minutes, okay? So, mechanisms, I already mentioned Behe, Darwin Devolves, and Axe. Doug Axe's book, Undeniable. We're just going to mention those in passing, and then mainly on the fossil record and what it tells us. Darwin Devolves saying about mutations. Mutations are really, really, really good at one thing. Can you guess what that is? Exactly. They break things, which means genes, gene clusters, transposons, activation signals, and I can name 10 other things. You know, mutations are very good at breaking or blunting or degrading systems. And an example would be polar bears. They're, not so much cuddly creatures. I'm told they're very fierce, defending their territory. But the white fur and the layer of very rich, fatty substance, the tissue beneath the fur, is due to the breaking and or blunting of a whole cluster of 5 genes. This was just discovered in the last few years and published. And there's a debate raging about Behe's book. And he's winning the argument because everybody who attacks him, he says, let's read the fine print of what they're saying in the DNA studies. What about the famous Galapagos finches that are used as proof of Darwin's theory? Does that show an advance? No. The finches that have the little pointy beaks have a unique ability. The unique ability is to develop that point out there, and it takes a certain gene cluster. The blunt beaks, which enables it to survive during, tough times, during drought, because it can break those hard to get at, seeds that have been sitting around for some time. So the blunt beak finches have a broken segment of DNA that turns the blunt beak, as it were, brings it out, forms it when the very narrow pointy beak should be there. So are you developing anything new? You're just breaking something. And there are many, many other examples. Like my eyes have blue tint. My wife says, oh, that blue shirt looks good with your blue eyes. Well, guess what? Thank you, DNA, you're broken. Blue eyes, it's in the book, by the way, are due to a broken genetic element. So if you have brown eyes, welcome to the excellence of true, full, ocular DNA. Yeah, way to go. All right. Almost perfect, So, and there are many, many other examples in the book, which I will not go into. And then what I've seen in Dr. Doug Axe's work, his book Undeniable is fantastic. And he shows in his work in the lab out in Washington State that if you just zoom in on a tiny protein valley and compare 2 sister proteins, when you actually remove each of these amino acids, one at a time, where did my amino acids go? Here they are. So if you take this amino acid out, then the contour of this valley that causes a chemical reaction to occur, and put another amino acid in, you can then test and see if it still works. Because you're trying to turn this wrinkle of a protein into a slightly different wrinkle on this sister protein. And if you count the number of mutations that are needed to convert this active site to the other function, it's 7. perfect number. 7 mutations are needed to cross that chasm. And he did the estimation. You would be able to fill the entire universe with this particular animal that has this particular, protein pair, and you could just let it evolve for 100 trillion times the age of the universe, 13.8 billion years, and it would not accomplish that minor change, let alone producing any of the proteins in the first place. So that's why, again, I think the signal of creation is very strong. I'm just going to go fast here because we need to get to the work in the fossil record. I'll just mention, if you want to see biogeography, that is often mentioned as a true, like a nail in the coffin of creationism, because animals, you can see their distribution across the world. But if you look at the Platyrrhine monkeys, their evolution doesn't fit with the breaking apart of the continents. So to explain why the same Platyrrhine monkeys are in Africa and South America, they proposed a theory that across the Atlantic Ocean, a group of monkeys rafted. You like that idea? That's the only thing they can come up with. There's no land bridge, okay? Because South America, from about, I think it was at least 70 million years to somewhere around 10 million years, but the fossil record shows Platyrrhine monkeys there starting 30 million years ago. So the only thing they can't question common ancestry. Right, that's off limits. You can't question that. So they have to go with a rafting hypothesis. And they, even in their own literature, say, well, this is a little bit implausible, but it's the best we have. And then common genetic code is a true marker, except when the common genetic code is not found. They just found exceptions to the common genetic code. And I say, you cannot use something as an indicator, and then when it turns around, say, well, the opposite of that is also an indicator. You see my point? It's blue, always, always, except when it's red. You get that? Okay. So, and I could go in deeper, and then Ann Gager is like I would describe her as the first lady of intelligent design. And she has shown that some of the key genes, they said you'd have to have 10,000 population of hominids turning into humans to get these genes. She said, no, if you look at the data, it shows that you would need 2 individuals, each with 2 alleles. That means on each pair of their chromosomes would have different substantial differences. And the 4 variations, 2 on Adam and 2 on Eve's DNA, can produce what we see perfectly. And the people, when she showed that, they said, oh, I guess you're right. That was their very intelligent response, okay? But sometimes we really do make headway when others do acknowledge some of these things before we bring out. Now, and this is the last topic. We'll be done in about 10 minutes and do Q&A. Darwin's greatest embarrassment, his greatest dilemma, is in the fossil record. This is an area I specialize in. We've collected, about $10,000 worth of fossils at our little museum down in Florida. If you're going to come to Tampa Bay, reach out to me, through the college, Trinity College. I'd be glad to give you a little private tour. But this is the earliest bat fossil. The structure of it, after they discovered it in the Eocene era, 50 million years back, that's the dating on it, they were astonished to see that it is identical to a modern brown bat. Now, wait a minute. So you're saying this bat is very ancient. It's probably the first complete bat fossil. Yeah, that's right. And yet you're saying that we could look outside and see a bat, a common brown bat, eastern United States, flying around, and its structure, its bone pattern would be identical to this bat. Yeah, that's right. Wait a minute. You said that this is an evolutionary process where things are changing gradually, and yet this bat is the first bat. That's right. You see the problem? The first bat looks like a modern bat. And this is called abrupt appearance. Some of you already know this. Harvard's Professor Stephen Jay Gould brought it out starting in the late 70s, early 80s. The pattern of fossil records is squarely against the Darwinian predictions. Darwin himself acknowledged this several times in his own writings. Now, I call this ubiquitous shock because everywhere you look, you see the same phenomenon. It's ubiquitous, like Coke signs. It's like McDonald's. Every country you go, you see McDonald's, okay? Well, this is everywhere you look in the fossil record, you see this pattern. Sudden appearance without transitions, and then stasis, which means stability. It's like a stuck in the rut situation. So this is a modern, what is this? Dragonfly, okay? In Latin America, it's a libélula, or if you're in the Dominican Republic, it's called caballito del diablo, the little horse of the devil. That's what they literally call it. That's kind of cute. Okay, now that's a modern dragonfly. You want to see the earliest dragonflies? What do you think? Radically different or pretty doggone close? Pretty close. Why? Is this not another signal that the Darwinian theory, which predicts steady, gradual, almost infinitesimal tiny step change, is developing and growing this tree? No, the tree arrives, ta-da, with a poof of smoke, fully formed. We see this when we see, for example, in the Cambrian strata. I remember when they announced in the year 2007, we have a very interesting jellyfish that has been found in Utah. As a matter of fact, they have, I think, 12 specimens, and this one is one of the most exquisitely preserved. You can actually see, if you do the careful analysis, the soft parts, the soft tissues. And then the remark came, this is identical to and then they named the modern species. But wait a minute, this is 530 million years ago. And you're saying that early, and you don't find much of anything earlier than this, it just appears, and then it hasn't changed since then. If you ask a paleontologist, they say, yeah, that's true. I thought that continual development was the key evidence for common ancestry. Let's go right into the Cambrian explosion. Here we have Permian, Mississippian, pickle and cheese, all beef patty and special sauce layers. So we have an interesting Big Mac version of the fossil record. But down Devonian all the way to Cambrian. Cambrian is about 540 to actually 495. That's the way they date it now. The Cambrian strata, and as seen in our very important video, we have these videos available, really special deal. But the video, Darwin's Dilemma, will give you a crash course, 1 hour and 5 minutes, I think. And it's fabulous. It tells you the whole story of these discoveries. So the Cambrian explosion is something that Darwin was aware of. They didn't call it the Cambrian explosion in his day. That name came about shortly after he died. But he was aware of the phenomenon of trilobites, brittle stars, ammonites, very complex animals appearing suddenly. And he said in chapter 6 of his book, this may be rightly urged as an argument against my theory. Very, very good statement, Charles Darwin. I'm thankful for that. And so then you see the same phenomenon continuing as the new discoveries come in China and Canada. Well, for example, one of my favorites is Opabenia. Opabenia has 5 eyes on its head, a piper cub tail, a little proboscis sticking out that it could actually grab prey, apparently, or food and pull it back to nibble on it. An animal so ugly only its mother could love it. And this animal appears suddenly, and then it settles into a stasis and never changes until it goes extinct. Now, I've always thought that the Cambrian explosion is the key signal coming from the data in fossils. And the failure can be summed up this way. No prediction of a succession of at least a dozen explosions after the Cambrian is seen anywhere in the Darwinian literature. And at this point, my students last week in my class at Trinity said, you mean there are more explosions? They're like, feed me, feed me. And it's in, again, I think it's the chapter by Gunther Beckley, a famous paleontologist from Germany, in that white book, the big white book. But I want to show you some of the other explosions. One took place right after the Cambrian. It's called the GOBE explosion, the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. That will be on the midterm. Okay, GOBE. And that explosion is quite remarkable. Antilignathus, seen here, artist conception, actual fossil. Do you see he has an eye peering through what looks like a bony goggle? Do you see that? So it's one of the more interesting structures of any fish ever discovered. He is one of hundreds of families and genera that appear. This is another view of Antilignathus. So in the hundreds, again, if you take standard dates, the hundreds of millions of years since the Cambrian, so Cambrian is down here, 540 to 490. And then you have Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, and this is where the dinosaurs suddenly appear. Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. The dinosaurs then disappear, and you have the more modern period, Paleocene to the present. Here are just a few of the fossil explosions, each one of which involves a massive appearance of new kinds of animals or plants, and then stasis. They never change. Are you ready? The Avalon explosion preceded the Cayman explosion. I could talk about that. They're feather and frisbee appearing animals. They appear for a while. They are not ancestors of Cayman animals. They then just disappear completely. The GOBE event, already mentioned that. The Nekton revolutions, a series of events happen here where suddenly creatures in the marine environment can swim. They have all kinds of complex swimming organs. Triassic explosions, a total of 4 of them occur in this era, each one unique in the kinds of animals and plants that are appearing. And last but not least, the Mosasaur explosion, and then the one that puzzled Darwin the most, flowering plants. He called this my abominable mystery. I declare I can give no explanation for the sudden appearance of flowering plants. So this to me is the most powerful signal of all. Here are some of the Nekton revolutions. I thought this was a really interesting, good-sized fossil. To talk about a doorstop. Now that would be like, I don't know, for a major garage door or more. And then we have a little close-up here. Let's go even in closer into this guy. The ammonoid creatures are really remarkable. And on this note, I will close and say that the important thing that we've discussed tonight is the signal. And I think the signal is telling us that we do not need to hold on to some key scientific claim that all animals are traceable to a common ancestor because the evidence is not strong. I won't say the evidence is non-existent. I want to be a careful scholar. But the evidence that's there is minimal and rather weak. The evidence, the signal otherwise of various kinds that I've given is one that was picked up by this gentleman in Budapest, Hungary. I was there in around the year 1991. So Phillip Johnson hadn't even published his book, Darwin on Trial. I was there lecturing with 4 other scientists. Christian Leadership Ministries, the faculty arm of Campus Crusade, sponsored the trip. We raised our ticket over, and we had a wonderful time. I lectured for the first night on scientific evidence for God. It was just down the street from the National Museum. This gentleman came up, and he said, very important, very significant information. I said, wow, this is really, I'm glad that you find it helpful. It's very significant. We talked for a bit. I said, well, why don't you come tomorrow night? The next night we had a discussion. Different lecturers spoke on evidence for God from the right and wrong, the moral law, and modern culture, and what it's saying. He came back. He was there, and he said, very important, very significant. I said, well, could we talk about this more? He said, yes, I have to leave. I have to get back to my family. But you could come down the street. We could talk tomorrow. I said, oh, is that where you work? He says, yes, I'm the curator heading up the geology department of the National Museum. Whoa, okay. I just prayed. I thought to myself, well, sure, let's go for it. I said, well, when do I come? About 10 o'clock. So I showed up at the side entrance he had pointed out to me. And I went in and was escorted to his office, palatial office, and he was sitting there, and he had put on the table a French Bible. He was very fluent in French, a little bit in English, but even more fluent in French. So I shared not just scientific evidence, but I shared with him the same passage that spoke to me, Isaiah 53. That Christ came, he was the suffering servant, paid for our sins, rose again, and the evidence of Christ offering us the gift of eternal life is overwhelming. And I was shaking, practically sitting on my hands. I said, would you like to receive this gift today? He said, oh, yes, it's very important, very significant. I said, well, we could invite Christ to be your Lord and Savior. I said, I would be glad to help you and guide you. He said, yes. And I was ready to lead him, and all of a sudden I saw him bow his head, and he was quietly praying. And then after he finished, I said, did you receive the gift of eternal life? He said, yes, I did. And so I said, let me pray. I prayed with him, tried to follow up the best. I had a copy of John Stott's book, Basic Christianity. You can see where I came back the next day, did a little follow-up, and then they didn't have the internet back then, but through various connection opportunities, We tried to minister. I didn't know what had happened to him after about 97. In the mid-2000s, my wife and I were back in Hungary, and I went to the museum. I said, "Is Dr. Embe István Antal still work here?" They said, "Oh, no, we don't know anything." I said, "Oh, no." I said, "No one knows." "Well, I haven't been here that long." So this lady turned around. "Dr. Embe István Antal." "Oh, yes, he's at the section, at the new museum just down the road." "Really?" He says, "Yes, let me call him." "Yes, Dr. Woodward is here." "Oh, you can come over. He can come over and see you." So I went over to the other museum, and we actually positioned ourselves in the same position. And you know what? He's following the Lord. He's having a witness at the National Museum. And he still thinks the signal from God is very important, very significant. And I think that's the whole purpose of discovering in the creation that God has made a parallel, like a confirmation of the word he's given us. And so a little bit heavy on the science. I'd be glad to entertain questions of another nature, less technical nature as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you. Okay? And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. You have some water there, I think.
Yeah.
If this my other job is Gunga Phillips. Do you have a question? Just one sec. I had a call this afternoon from a gentleman who's been associated with our ministry off and on for a while, and he said, please, he was there last night at Johnson Ferry. He said, please tell me that they made a video recording of that. I said, no, they didn't. And you could hear the crestfallen nature. I said, but they're going to do it tonight, right? So if we're very fortunate and things have worked out technologically, we should have a video recording of this, and that will be brought back to us with CDs at future meetings, or is there a different way to distribute that? Oh, it'll be posted online. That's even better, theareopagus.org, right? Okay, so that would be great. And that which brings me to a point that when we do a Q&A, we've got about 15 to 20 minutes maybe to do Q&A. One of the things that's very important is that, well, several things. First is that please make your questions questions. Not the time for a statement or a soliloquy, but if you make your questions as direct as possible, and Tom will do his best to answer them as quickly as directly as possible, so that we can get as many in as possible, right? And also, because we have only this one mic that I can move around with, I'd like to give you the mic to ask your questions for two reasons. Because many of us are at that point in the maturity continuum where it's really, really good to be able to hear things, right? And so we'd like people to know what the question is, so that when we hear Tom's answer, who's suitably mic'd, we know what's going on there as well. And also, it will get on our tape as well. So with those things in mind, a lot of times people aren't anxious to ask the first question. So does anybody have the second question? Oh, heck, I'll start with Eric. Well, I'll be right back. I saw you.
So I read an article recently with an argument in favor of the existence of junk DNA, stating that since the vast majority of mutations have no noticeable effect, therefore whatever DNA they occur in must be junk, because it's not showing any biological effect, and so therefore most of our DNA must be junk, even if it looks to be otherwise. So I was wanting to hear your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that article. Can you tell me where it was published or where it came from? I mean, what was this on Reasons to Believe or?
No, actually I was helping my wife grade some of her students' papers, and it was an article that they had printed out for an assignment, so I don't remember what it was from.
I mean, all I can say is the striking, and I'll use that term, maybe use it too much, but I don't think really we can use it too much. The signal coming from the unified, now this is a set of discoveries based on work done at 80 labs around the world. It's called ENCODE. I don't know if you're familiar with ENCODE. Like, I'm going to encode this message. Okay, it's capital letters, ENCODE, and I forget what each of the letters of that acronym mean, but the ENCODE project, an original draft 2007, final draft 2012, shocked the world and basically decimated, pulverized the junk DNA hypothesis. And it was based on the fact that 70% approximately, some say as low as 50, some say as high as 93, but roughly 70% of your DNA is being opened and turned into RNA copies. And it is deeply implausible that the cell would waste energy making copies of DNA that played no function. That's one reason. Number two, those sections of supposedly, line and sine, L-I-N-E, S-I-N-E, and other transposons, those kinds of like non-gene chunks of DNA, those are heavily conserved. And what does that mean? Well, you find the same code, the same precise code across different phylogenetic families and even phyla. And if there's a conservation, that is a maintenance of that code that is not affected by mutations or what we call neutral drift. Neutral drift has the idea it's non-selectionist, it's just sort of random mutations without selection. So the best answer I can give without seeing that article is that I don't think that that is an overall accurate or completely globally fair statement based on what the ENCODE researchers came up in their labs across the world, originally published 2007, and then reiterated in a more complete form in 2012. So I would love, if you can send me that, I'd love to pursue that if you want to pursue it.
I'll ask and see if my wife still has
Okay, very good, very
Tom?
interesting.
Tom,
I
we're
was
back-
interested on what.
We're back here?
Yeah,
My voice doesn't work very well, but
You're good.
You're tightly packaged, and I was curious about all the ages and the length of time versus when we counted generations in the Bible, how far back it is to Adam and Eve. I know you didn't really discuss that, but if you have some comment on that
Oh.
discrepancy.
that's that's not my specialty. I mean, how controversial do we want me to get?
I do middle earth if I
Jeffrey?
were you.
Do I go with chrysanthemum now? Okay, I'm pass. See me later over at the table. I'll just say, is it possible that neither the young Earth, young universe, or the old universe, old Earth, old universe, is it possible that neither of those systems has it completely right? And I think the answer is yes. And so that's all. That's just a hint. That's just like a little, squidgen. Squidgen is one half of a smidgen, right? Okay, of my thought on that. Okay, yes.
I think one of Dr. Collins' reasons for his belief in the whole evolutionary scheme is the common ancestry and the computer modeling that he did with the shared DNA with lower life forms, right? 95%, 98% shared DNA with.
Dr. Collins.
Dr. Francis Collins,
Yeah.
So what's your favorite explanation for shared DNA that's the same, in humans and chimps, for instance?
Okay, I love that question. Thank you very much. I did not pay him to say that, okay? This is one area where I've done a considerable amount of research. I don't claim to be super expert, but the one thing about chimp human DNA comparisons is astounding. Let me give you a couple quick points. Point number one. The chimp human DNA comparison, which is constantly stated or frequently stated to be 98 to 99% identical, is manifestly and totally wrong. It is anywhere from 83 to 86% difference, which is remarkable considering the similar morphology. The functional, actual makeup of the structure of the body and the organ systems is really quite close, which is what we would expect. I mean, the whole Linnaean system, phyla, class, superclass, class, and you get down to order and then family and then genus and species, broad to narrow. That whole Linnaean system was developed by a creationist. Carolus Linnaeus was a staunch creationist. And so the Darwins, we just took this over and we'll just kind of connect it with dotted lines. Well, the second bit of evidence, besides the fact that there is not a 99%, comparison, is that when you get to the Y chromosome of a chimp, that's only the males carry the Y chromosome, right? Women, 2 X chromosomes, men, X and Y. That smaller Y chromosome is so radically different between the humans and the chimps that the discoverers, when it was finally published, said, oh my goodness, this is shocking. How do we explain this? That in such a short time, when other chromosomes, relatively speaking, are comparable, that the Y chromosome was so radically different. Third point is that when you get into the supposed chromosome fusion theory of chromosome 2, so if you're into this chimp thing, chromosome 2, where it supposedly has the connection point where these 2 earlier chromosomes in chimps were fused into 1 chromosome in humans, it has totally turned against that theory because there are no what are called basically TTAGGG okay, repeats in the middle, and any repeats there are, which is an indication of the end of a chromosome, former chromosome, when you have these very weird patterns. It's like a stutter pattern. Tag, tag, tag. It doesn't carry information. It's just like a cap on the end of a chromosome. So try to say that 10 times, okay? But the tag, that pattern is almost absent at the fusion point. Secondly, there's an active gene right at the fusion point. How likely is that to crop up, since chimps and humans diverged according to the theory? And I can give you other examples of where I don't think the evidence fits any putative model that makes sense. And the radical difference in the gene count, the line and sign differentials. I mean, there's a lot of evidence. What I'd say is read John Cohen's article, 2007, and he calls it The Myth. Now, this is a secular journal. Science is not a Christian-run journal or creationist by any putative, any possible imaginative scenario. But John Cohen says The Myth of the 1%. That's the title of his article. And he shows 7 ways that the chimps and humans are much further apart.
We have one down here in front.
I really liked it when you said that you didn't have enough faith to believe in, these evolutionary processes, and it's broken. Evolution's broken. Darwinism.
Macroevolution is broken. Microevolution is in good shape. I mean, microevolution is no big deal, and that's where I think what we should agree. I'm sorry, that didn't mean to hijack
that's okay.
it.
That's
so I
okay.
think I'm just saying microevolution it fits the evidence beautifully, and that's where Darwin got it right. I think we should say, enthusiastically, Darwin, you got it right. Microevolution, and that's what Behe is really explaining finally through his Darwin devolves. So
I just wanted to know what you're seeing in the overall scientific community, and is there a big movement where people are really seeing that it's broken, or is it still a matter of faith? I mean, no, but they're never going to see it's broken.
Do you remember I had the 3 tiers? I put abiogenesis, the undirected source of life coming, Luca, whatever the first cell was. That is shattered to pieces. It was never strong, even when the spark experiment produced random collisions of atoms, through the spark. It was producing amino acids. But that experiment, again, see Steve Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell. Fantastic book. So spark experiment, all the origin of life experiments have led to greater and greater despair. And I think that they're basically, it's like in a cul-de-sac. And they just don't realizing they're ever mapping in more finer grain the contours of a cul-de-sac. There are additional research. Secondly, that middle section where I said the mutation selection mechanism of Darwin is under heavy fire, that is beginning to weaken to the point of collapse. And that's the evidence of that is that the Royal Society, one of the oldest science societies in the world, held a special meeting 2.5 years ago. And the Royal Society called in the traditional Darwinists and this new group who have rejected Darwin's mechanism and says that it doesn't do anything. And they're bringing in what we call them, rescue mechanisms. In other words, we're discovering new mechanisms that can take the place of the Darwin mechanism that is falling and failing. What they are loath to ever give up is the common ancestry tree of life. Now that part they try to retain, but as I tried to show you, the fossil evidence and even the biogeographic evidence, and Michael Behe is showing even the biochemical structures of machines, argues against common ancestry. Now he holds it slightly still, but I think his endorsement of common ancestry is weakening. What I would say is this last week I received a book, Foresight. Have you ever heard of Foresight? Just came out. The author is Marcos Eberlin, one of the leading scientists in Brazil, and Discovery Institute published his book. Now that's really amazing that he's one of the most noted mass spectrometers. I know that you probably don't spend a lot of time in a mass spectrometry lab, nor have I, but mass spectrometry is important. He's written 1,000 articles. He's recognized around the world as one of the top guys. He is the leader of intelligent design for the country of Brazil. So it's like having a budding biological Einstein as the leader of your movement. His book, which was just published, has not 1, not 2, but 3 endorsements from Nobel Prize winners. Now that was the shock heard around the world. Never in the history of any intelligent design book has even 1 Nobel Prize winner endorsed any book. This had 3. And the whole Darwin community is like, oh my goodness. now we have to deal with this. Just as Michael Behe's completed his trilogy, with the book Darwin Devolved. So to me, it's a very exciting time. Now, Doug Axe was telling me if you had two scientists working together in the same lab at the same university, and they knew that they were protected, that is, they weren't going to be fired or lose their grant money, they had such a massive reputation. He says, I know of some clusters of scientists who can't even tell publicly what they think about this. They can't indicate publicly that they really are open to design theory. And he says if you had two or three, maybe somebody protecting them at the level of the department head, if they jointly went public, the whole situation could change overnight. It's that fragile. So I think what I ask people to pray for sequoias. God specializes in yanking this Saul and planting him like a sequoia. Who'd imagine that the most powerful, vociferous, most dedicated enemy of Christianity would become the greatest missionary? Okay, this happened with Günter Beckley, the paleontologist in Germany. He wrote the article that I read that fed in all these little explosions. Günter Beckley was an atheist in 2009, but he did something very dangerous. He read Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. And he said, when I read the book, he said, I realized all the propaganda I've been fed was completely false. These guys are not trying to turn the world into a theocracy. They're just trying to get out the best answers to these questions. So that led to reading another book and reading another book, and pretty soon he was quietly, privately in contact with Discovery Institute. They worked with him. He became, within 3 years, 100% convinced that everything he had been teaching in his Stuttgart Natural History Museum was wrong. He not only became a defender of ID, but he's now a follower of Christ. So another sequoia has been plucked from the rocks, if you will, of that Darwinian landscape and planted in the garden of Christ. So I think we can pray that God would go through the world and pluck more and more at an ever-increasing rate sequoias.
Another one up front here.
I've read that Darwin, before he really got into random selection, was greatly influenced by books on time of millions and billions of years.
True.
And God's time evidently is very different than ours in that he can reduce all of eternity in hell to 3 hours on a cross and can speak light and creation into existence by voice. How do we deal with throwing out random selection, yet still accepting the billions and millions of years as a fact?
Well, again, this is not going to be the topic tonight, so let me address that as quickly as I can, efficiently, and let you come up and discuss this with me. I think that the time issue is very tricky. I encourage my students to know the best arguments for a younger Earth, even though they may be older Earth, and I want my students to also, especially a lot of my class as younger Earth, I want them to know the best arguments for an older Earth. And at the same time, I present to them the importance that if you take even a straightforward view of Genesis, which I do, okay, a historical view, it doesn't to me imply that the universe was created on day one. If anything, a literal reading of Genesis implies that when light rays hit the primordial raw materials of the earth, which have been sitting there who knows how long, I don't know how long, that when that happened, the heavens and the earth had already been created prior to that. And then God set up this sequence of 6 days in which he's actively shaping the creatures from the largest to the smallest, from animals to plants and everything in between. So what I would say is the time criteria, I think are very tricky. I have no problem with the Big Bang, personally, as God's way of launching the universe. But I want to also know the best arguments or indicators against the standard Big Bang hypothesis. Because the important thing as a Christian, I think, responsible scholar, is that we not set up a straw man of the other position and proceed to knock it down. And when a person who knows that position better than I say, well, you didn't really present it accurately. Okay, I don't want to do that. I'm not saying any of us here are doing that, but that's where I think our heart should be in representing the truth of the tricky, discussions of the truth about this area, okay? Was that the namby-pamby enough for you? Okay. Talk about a fence sitter here.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Some wag has said that there were 3 things that we inherited from the 19th century. We inherited Freud, Marx, and Darwin. And of course, Freud you don't hear very much about anymore. Marx, well, he's got a lot of supporters out there, but we may be headed for what may be a seminal election here with if the left in America goes with some form of socialism, and we have on the right we have some clear choice about capitalism. That might be interesting. I don't think it would settle the matter, but it's interesting to see Darwin under attack as well, and to see things changing in there, because we know that there groups for now the last decade, groups of high-level Darwinists have been meeting in secret, basically, and saying, what are we going to do next? Because there's really Altenberg 16 and things like that.
Yeah.
We just don't know.
Altenberg
We don't know
16
what's
is
happening.
this extended evolutionary synthesis. And this group that goes to Austria, I mean, these are top, Gunther Wagner, Yale University. Now, he's not a design proponent, but he says clearly, the Darwinian method, or mechanism rather, mutation selection is not providing the answers that we need. So that part, the mechanism, is in a state of meltdown. And that leads to then questioning the common ancestry.
Right. So we have maybe time for one more question. Yes? Okay. This is a very productive row.
3 in a row here.
Row two.
You mentioned earlier the micro versus macro evolution.
Yes.
That's something way back in engineering school, way back for me, I realized that distinction really needs to be clearer. If you could just briefly elaborate on
Sure.
what you said.
Sure.
Because when people say evolution is, quote, false, you can't say that. You need to say macro, micro, make that distinction.
Yeah. Okay, well, for example, blind fish that are found swimming in caves where there is no light, and other blind animals of sorts. Clearly, if they can't use their eyes in that setting because there's no light coming in, then to maintain an eye structure is excess baggage. And to compete for survival, again, it's a perfect example of Darwin devolves. But it's maybe counterintuitive, but sometimes breaking, blunting, or completely tossing overboard into the genetic dumpster, DNA, may be advantageous, because breaking DNA is pretty easy. Statistically, it's much faster and easier to do than ever creating a single gene. You get the difference? And that's so brilliantly explained in Behe's newest book. But given that, what I would say is microevolution deals with what are called outer rim gene clusters. Okay, the control genes, there's actually a circuit board that sets up the animal when the sperm and the ovum, sperm and the egg meet. And that's called the developmental gene regulatory network. I just taught my students about it. We call it the little d GRN. GRN is capitalized. Now, there are various GRNs. It's like, and if you've seen some of these printed circuit boards, like an IBM computer has all these transistors, diodes, capacitors, whatnot. Okay, I don't understand anything about electrical engineering, but it looks very, very cool and very complex. The purple sea urchin. Get this, the ground zero developmental gene cluster has 94 genes. It only has, I think, about 5,000 genes. But almost 100 of them are devoted just to setting up the main floor plan. And once they are done, then it turns it over to other gene clusters, and then they click on, and they're doing their little circuit board thing. And then that leads up to higher circuit boards. You talk about complicated. It looks like the most amazing phenomenon you'd ever imagine. But what is tricky is that the gene cluster at the base, the DGRN, Developmental Gene Regulatory Network, you cannot mutate it. If you do, the animal basically says, you killed me, goodbye, thank you very much. You see, because the lethal mutations always happen at the lowest level. When you get out to these other clusters, you can mutate those, fiddle with them. But those are like the color of the feather or the shape, the size of this or that organ structure. And we all know, look at the beauty of the variety in this room. And we're all from Adam and Eve, I would posit. I would propose it for your consideration, that Adam and Eve did come into existence through God's direct creation. And so the microevolutionary development of everything, every variety in humanity is a glorious manifestation of the plasticity of the wiggle room that is created. It's there inherent, not at the local, at the base level, what's called the DGRN, but the little gene regulatory networks that click on, and then you can fiddle-faddle at the higher levels. Those are much easier to change. They're more plastic. But guess what? To do macroevolution, what do you need to change? The DGRN.
Species.
Well, yeah, actually, those might be as higher as a family level. Yeah, species, Behe gives examples where new species are coming into existence. They're not very often, but by breaking blunting genes. But when you get to the higher levels, you can deal with that, but if you break any of the genes at the basic level that determines whether it's a giraffe, an elephant, tiger, or a fish or whatever, a chrysanthemum, okay, that's what you can never really mutate. And yet that's where macroevolution would have to be rooted. So the discovery that you can't mutate the DGRN, the root, the starting point, to me forbids macroevolutionary change. It's like God says through the genes crying out, "You killed me." Okay, God sends them that signal in a new way. So that's a little bit heavy, but if you go to Steve Meyer's book, I think it's chapter 17 or 18, okay, Steve Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, he has a wonderful section on that GRN, okay?
All right.
Thank
Could we express our appreciation to Dr. Woodward?
Thank you.
Tom, I assume you'll be able to stay around for